Just waiting for the stream to come on. I'm hoping it will come on soon. Hey, here we go. It's coming on. Bitrate's a bit rubbish this morning for some reason. It's a little bit pixelated. Welcome to Thursday. It is, what is the time? It is 7:32 a.m. British summer time. And today we are going to work through the hydration parts of this invoicing application. The hydration parts mean that these are the areas of the code that will hydrate the entities, will populate the entities from the data in the database. So this is the in-between part, if you will. Yesterday we made some inroads into actually connecting to PDO through PHP. So that's connecting to the MySQL from PHP. Now we want to have the ability of hydrating the entities based on the rows that are in the database. Just bear with me a mo whilst I go into the code and just fiddle with a couple of bits and pieces. So this is a live stream. I think it's 25. Yeah, it's been an interesting ride, this project. A lot of things have been working more than I've expected in a short period of time, which is good. I've just ran the Docker machine start, so I need to do the Docker machine eval, which is awesome. And also what I will demonstrate is a couple of Git issues that I have recently created. I say recently, it was only in the past couple of minutes. So if we go to the browser here, we now have 9 open issues. These are pretty much following the same pattern. So you have a manager and then you have a hydrator. I'll talk about the difference between the two in just a second. But they follow the same. They follow the same sort of mechanism where the hydrator hydrates the data, the manager manages that data. These are the sort of the terminologies that I'm using. And I'll let you know why I've got to the invoice item manager as further investigation, because I'm unsure to that. So first of all, let's just talk about what a hydrator is compared to what a manager is, because this is something that we were delving with at the end of the last stream, and I started hacking together some code. So if you think of the flow between some code in the controller making a request to the database, and then that returns an actual entity, which is in the PHP object that represents the record. If you think of that whole process, this is what we're trying to quote unquote map out. So you're in the controller and you make a call to something which is going to find you records, or a record. Let's just focus on one. So a record based upon perhaps the ID that you have or other where clauses that you wish to query against. So something in that piece of magic needs to connect to the database if a connection hasn't been established already. It needs to know which table you're querying. It needs to know which query method to call, and then it needs to actually make that query and discover that if there is any records that match that where clause or whatever the condition that you've supplied. And then after all of that, it needs to then call upon something to then hydrate the entity in which that represents, based upon all the and supply all the data that it's found from the database. So this is actually quite a very involved piece of work, and you know it's quite. I was thinking about it this morning when I got up, and last night before I went to sleep. It is actually very complicated, But I think if we start focusing on small portions of it first and define where something starts and where something ends, then I think that we will slowly piecemeal it out together. So the hydrator I'm terming as the mechanism that hydrates the data from wherever, right, and then returns the represented entity that comes from that you've hydrated. So that's the hydrator. The hydrator should be completely agnostic as to where the data is coming from. It doesn't care where the data is coming from. It could even just be hard-coded data, or it could be from a database, or it could be from somewhere else. Okay, that doesn't matter. All we're giving it's a very basic input, process, output. You're giving the input, which is the data, which is the raw data. You're processing that data, and then you're outputting the entity that you've created. So that, I think we start with the hydrators, because that is a nice, confined, isolated piece of work. Then you have the managers. Now the managers will deal with the act of making that happen. So that will call upon the repositories and their subsequent methods. So the repositories, I'll show you whilst I blather on. So in the code here, we have a series of repositories. If I go down to here, so these are the repositories. These are the things that will make the actual act of making that call. So find one by, and so forth. The managers will also deal perhaps with the saving of these data, this data, the persistence layer, if you will. Okay, so that's what the managers will do. Sorry, that's what the repositories will do. Sorry, the managers, therefore, if I go into the status manager, will then call upon, will be almost like decorators. They will decorate the repositories. So find one of the manager represents find one of the repository, which then calls upon the hydrate of the hydrator, and then returns the entity that has been hydrated based upon the data that the repository has got. So that's kind of like the whole shebang from start to finish. Now the question and the query is that this is all well and good if you've only got one table that only represents one thing, or only has one thing connected to it and is not associated to any other table. Where we're talking about other tables that are connected to other tables via foreign keys, some sort of linkages type thing, then we need to build upon some intelligence into this to actually say, well, hang on a minute, this record, this field data, field value that I've got is actually an ID of another table from another table. So for example, this is why on the browser here I have this on the invoice item needs further investigation, and really it's also the same for the invoice itself, because if we had a look at the invoice schema that we built the other week, so if I scroll up here to MySQL, if we had a look at the schema, which is in here, of the invoice, then we can see that we are actually referencing the status table and the customer table through these foreign keys. And the invoice item is more interesting because the invoice item has the foreign key of the invoice ID. And there's more than one invoice item to an invoice, right? Or there could be. So we need something that will say, for each one of these IDs that we have that's come back from this repository, we then need to make a subsequent call to the database to then find out the record for that ID. We then have to discover whether that table, that data that has been returned from that call, also contains a foreign key link, and then find that. So it gets a little bit convoluted. So this is why I'm kind of starting with the status table, because the status doesn't have anything at all. It's just itself. It's just a self-contained table. Same with the customer table, really. It's only when we get to the invoice that is linked to both of those, status and customer, and then the invoice item that is linked to the invoice. It's only when we get down to those kind of levels that we have to then start thinking about, well, where does one make the subsequent call? Are we making that within the hydrators? Are we making that within the managers? Or perhaps are we even doing it in the repositories, which I don't think we should be doing. So that will be an interesting thing. What I would like to do today is just focus on the status itself and then perhaps the customer, maybe if we've got some time, because they're the isolated cases. And we're going to do this in a sort of a test-driven type mechanism, type manner as well. So let's start kicking that off. This is the pseudocode that I created yesterday. So with the status manager, we have all of these things calling upon the fictitious hydrator. Yeah, I think what I'm going to do is just put a pin in this, to be honest, because I'm not sure whether this is the right mechanism. The flow of this is okay, but I don't think we should be calling the hydrator like this, perhaps. So I'm just going to put a pin in this for now. I'm just going to move on and then get to that later. If I did a git, where are we? Git branch. Which branch are we on? If I can type correctly, we are on the 26 status manager. So at the moment, if I go back to the browser, the managers here, we're on 29, sorry. 29, which is here, the status manager. I've sort of referenced them to the hydrators themselves, which means that I think we're going to start building them out sort of parallel for the time being, because one really relies on the other. But then when I get sort of an actual pattern fathomed out, an algorithm, if you will, of how this is all going to stand up, algorithm probably isn't the right word, but some sort of mechanism, if I get that sort of foundational work done, then we can probably start working on each the manager and the hydrator in smaller portions. So what I'm going to do, if I go back to the code here, is I'm going to create some tests. I'm going to go back to our lovely test suite, which is here, and we're going to create some unit tests. Because, excuse me, as I mentioned earlier, the hydrator shouldn't really be bothered by how the data is being fetched. It should only be bothered by the data that it is given, which means that we don't need to worry too much about the whole connection-wise, the connecting to the database at all. Let's have a look. We've got this in SRC. This is in Manager. I want to create something called Hydrator. So if I remember rightly, we need to do, we probably need to dive into the codeception, I think, into codeception through the through the Docker container. So let's do a exec of the web bash, and then let's do a I can't remember. Is it vendor bin codeception? I think it's is it I can't remember. Let's do a list. I'm looking for generate test. There we go. That's what I need to do. So it's generate test test. It is a unit test, and it is going to go into hydrator. And it's just going to be status. Status, I think, is probably what I need. So there we go. We've created hydrator and status test. So let's scroll down to here. We've got units. We should have now hydrator and status test. Wonderful. Okay. 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 Okay, cool. I was just wondering why PHP Storm had flagged that up with a typo, which is a bit bizarre, but okay. So we want to test some features. So we're going to test the hydration. And what we're going to do is we're going to create a hydrator. So we're going to do and I'm thinking that this needs to be static. I don't think that this needs to be I don't think there needs to be a constructor. And I'll talk about my reasonings soon, but I think what I need to do is I need to do this. I need to do hydrator is equal to status hydrator, which doesn't work yet, and I do appreciate that because we haven't got that yet. And that is then going to do hydrate. And we're going to pass in some data. That should actually return an entity. And the entity should be, if I did this assert, there should be an assert instance of. The expected instance is a status class, and that is the entity that we've got. So I think we call upon the status hydrator and then we push in the data. So the data needs to be whatever is being returned from that repository. So if we're dealing with arrays here, we could do sort of ID is equal to 1, and then the status had a name, and we're going to call this test. And we've also got internal name. Whoops. And that's going to be all caps test. And then what we could do underneath, if I just made this a little bit smaller, I've of course now lost my terminal window. That's a marvelous feat of achievement there, Pete. Well done. So if we copy that, paste that in, because we can also check for things like, now we know that that is the entity, we can do assert same. We have, is that expected? So the expected would be 1. The entity here would be get ID. Then we would have another one, which is get name. So that name would be test. And remember, I mentioned that the assert same also checks the data type as well, which is really, really handy. So that would be the get name call. And then we also have the internal name too. So that is going to be test. And that is going to be get internal name. So this is kind of where I want to be, right? So you pass in this data. Now this data is going to come off of the back of the repository, which is coming out of the database. So this would be the raw data that we've got. And then we want to hydrate it, return a instance of the status entity. So I'm going to put some groups in here just because that's what I do. Oops. So we're going to start with the grouping of hydrator. And we're going to do group at group. Let's move this up a bit. Sort of, it's not hydrator and then status. Okay, excellent. So now if I can find my terminal window again, I should be able to run this. If I can find it. Tool windows, terminal. There is a shortcut key. I could use that. Okay, so we have this here. So I'm going to run this hydrator. So we're going to do vendor bin, we're going to do run unit, and we're going to do -g, passing that through. So that's going to fail horrendously because we don't actually have the status hydrator built yet. But this is giving me an idea of how I would like to do this. Now, I've chosen to do this in a static manner rather than actually create an instance of a class, because I think that these things are going to be very light. I don't think they're going to require any other dependencies. And doing it in a static manner like this forces me to not have any dependencies. I think these are small little utility classes, these hydrations. Which means if I go down that path, it means that these hydrator methods are going to be less likely to call upon the repositories, to call upon the other data for things like the foreign keys. Okay, so the hydrations won't actually go back to the database and call the database again to get the other bits and pieces, which means that perhaps we need to have a layer above, which in my head actually is starting to make a little bit more sense, a little bit more comfortable, because you are now saying that the hydrator only hydrates the data that has been given. It doesn't go off and find any other data to hydrate. It is only something that it's almost like a read-only type thing. Okay, so let's go and build this out. So we have this status. So let's go to the src here. We're going to create a new folder, and we're going to call this, believe it or not, hydrator. I'm actually going to call it hydration, because in the hydration we have hydrators. I'm not going to bother with the whole type thing. I want to try and move away from that. I think that the whole having a subfolder of type gets a little bit complicated. I'm just going to call this status hydrator. Let's just copy one of these things. Probably the interface is not a good idea, but let's just copy that and paste that in. Let's just move all of this down so we can make a little bit of room. This is, of course, now the status hydrator. It doesn't extend anything at all. Not that I'm aware of at the moment. It doesn't need to. It does need to use that entity. Excuse me. This is app hydration. It's not going to need any of this stuff, so we'll remove all of that. But we do need to have a public static function, and this function is going to have be called hydrate, and we're going to take an array of data, and we're going to return a status, public function, of course. There we go. Why didn't that hook that up? So we're going to return public static function, hydrate, and that is going to return status. So now we need to make the mechanism that builds the entity. So first of all, we need to create the entity. So we do entity is equal to new entity. New status rather. And then we do entity set name, or let's do set ID first. And this is going to be data, variable data, ID. And then, of course, we have set name, I think. Because this is all abstract, we need to do that last. Sorry, beg your pardon. So this is entity set name. So this is data, variable data, name. And then, sorry, what am I doing here? We don't need, let's chain these together. Sorry, right. There we go. Then the next one is set internal name, which is data, internal name. Then what do we have? We have the date created and date updated, which of course I haven't put in the tests yet, but we can sort those out. So this is now data, and then this is date created. Now notice that this requires a date time. So we're going to need to sort that out. Let's do set date. That's this is updated. This one will be date created. Set date created. Yeah, so those two need a date time instance. So we can do that. We can do date created is equal to. I think we might be able to do this in a static manner as well. Date time, and then create from format. Can we do that, or can we just do? New date time, passing in date created. Now this certainly throws up a question, and that is of validation, because of course we are not aware at all that data actually has anything. If it's got to this point, then we would like to think that it does, but we don't know, like, if that is the case. Really, I guess the argument is, at what point do we validate the data from the database? Is it before we put them in the database? Are we assuming that everything in the database is valid, or should we validate it again before we come back? When we have frameworks and stuff and libraries such as Doctrine, they use like mapping files to map the field values to the entities, and in those mapping files you can alter around the actual data types of things. And of course in the annotations and all of that jazz as well. We certainly won't go that far, but we need to consider it at the very least. Okay, so that's that done, and then what we do is we return entity. So, okay, let's have a slurp of tea and then start thinking about running this. So if we go back to the test here, let's sort of work through that. So that's status hydrator. That needs to be status hydrator going from the hydration mechanism. And let's see if we can run that and see what happens here. Okay, so that's still failed, and it's because there is an undefined index state created. So we must have this back. So we must have date created. Now, why would we ever not have date created? Because it certainly is the representation. I guess what we could do in the hydrator is we could add some checks. But I don't think we'll ever get to a point where we won't actually have this record back, all of in its entirety, because I think what we're going to do is we're just going to run select all calls. So we're not going to select individual fields. We're not going to select individual fields from the table. We're going to select everything. So I don't think there will be a use case where we have partial data coming through, unless of course we go and change the schema, and we haven't changed this. So I'm less concerned with that. And to be honest, This is only a small application. We don't have to go massively overboard. Perhaps if I was building this as a framework, then perhaps it would be as a framework for other things. Then yes, I would definitely consider doing more of a rigorous test check on that. So we've got date created. That needs to be in a reasonable format, I believe. We could just do date time and then format, create from format. Sorry, no. What am I doing? Sorry. Date is equal to new date time, and then we do date variable date, and then it's format from format, which is date time, and then the date time of the format, I believe, is it ISO 8601? I think that is the case. Let's put that in. Okay, just remove all of this. There is a nifty shortcut key called on Mac it's Command Alt and then I think it's Shift, which does a nice little arrangement change of the code, but we want to use date time because I don't like having fully qualified stuff in my code. I just think it doesn't look good. It's not easy to read when you've got like backspaces all over, forward spaces, slashes all over the place. So I'd rather have all of that stuff in the imports. This is going back from my Python sort of experience. So date updated up here. That's the next one, and that's the sort of a same thing. I don't know why that's in brackets there. That seems fine. Obviously that needs to go like so. Oh yeah, the bracket was because of this and that. Okay, so this is looking good. So that's the data representation. So let's run this again and see if this is running through. Still an error. Okay, what's the error here? Undefined index ID. Undefined index ID. Why is that? Because I've passed ID here. Oh, okay, that's because of the space. There we go. Okay, so that has gone through, which I'm very happy about. That's cool. So now what we can do is we can do the same thing, but for the customer, really. Let's work through that, or let's think for a minute. Actually, let's still focus on the status. Let's not move away from that. So we have the manager. We now have the ability to hydrate from here. So we do find one, and we get the row. Excuse me. We could, because it's a static method, we could do this. We could do. So we remove that. We could do this. We could do status hydrator, hydrate passing in the row. That's what we could do. Which I think looks comfortable in my head. I think we've got the row, we're doing the find one, and then we're hydrating it off of there. I would probably perhaps put some checking around all of this stuff. Perhaps. But now you see what we can do is in the controller, if I go back to sort of like the home controller, we can call upon... sorry, if we were to do this in a sort of controller thing, we could do repo is equal to, I don't know, new status manager. It's not even a repo, is it? This is manager, status manager, find one by, and we pass in the ID of perhaps 1, and this would be the entity. So what we've done is we've instantiated a new manager. I might find a better way of actually passing that through into the controller, and then we call find one off of that instance that we've created, and then that will then call, if I did find one, that will then call the repository, which will do the find one, which will then make the database query and return that record. And then that will go back to the manager, and then hydrate the row that the find one has found, using the hydrate mechanism that we've created just here, and then that will return the entity. And so in the controller, we just have a single line, which is what I wanted in the original place, of just finding the entity and returning that back, which then of course I can then pass into the view, and then do bits and pieces on that in the template. So I'm thinking this isn't such a bad solution right now. I'm still a bit dubious at the moment as to how I'm going to deal with the invoice and the invoice item, because they're a little bit of an anomaly. Bear with me just a sec. Okay. All right, so I'm just going to remove all of this for now, because this is just like pseudocode. This isn't, it's not going to do anything. I don't want to break the controller at all doing all of this stuff. This is under the hood code. Okay. So let's now take a look at I think I'm going to move on to the customer. I think I'm going to move on because the customer is extremely similar to the status, because it is itself an isolated leaf in our entity relationship diagram. So customer test, and the customer will have the dates and the IDs and certain stuff, but I think we also have excuse me, I think we also have, if I go back to the schema of the customer, where are we? Because the thing is, if I was to do this in another stream, it would just be like a very similar stream to the invoice. So I'm going to try and what do they say? Kill two birds with one stone, that kind of thing. So company name, first name, and last name. They're the differences of the between the customer and the manager from the hydration's point of view. Okay, so we have is it? Oh, I've forgotten it now. Customer name, company name, I forget. Company name. In fact, I'm just going to grab that and bung it into here just for reference, because I will forget. There we go. Okay, so we have company name, and of course the data needs to be in the same field, sort of format, I should say, as the field names. So they need to have the underscores in the right places. So we're going to do company name is How to Code Well. First name is Peter. Last name is Fisher. Let's do not How to Code Well. Let's just do Acme Inc. And then, okay, so we then do a similar thing as we've done before, where we are checking the return of these things. So that would be the company name. So this is get company name. get company name. If I can, come on, spell it correctly. There we go. And then we have the first name, which is Peter. So that's get first name. We have also a last name as well. Oh, sorry, Fisher. Which is get. And we're going to call upon the customer hydrator, which hasn't been built yet, of course. That is going to be the customer. Let's just tidy up these imports because I'm sure there's something wrong here. That should be customer hydrator. That should be the customer. Okay, so like I said, very, very similar to the status. Yeah, okay, let's go back and run this. This needs to be that. Let's run this and see if this. Well, this obviously won't work. Obviously. Let's just. Okay, here we go. Yeah, that failed. Group. Oh, actually. Let's just run hydrator. Hydrator customer. Okay, yep, because the hydrator itself isn't there. So we'll create one. We'll just copy the if I can find where I've put it in hydration. We'll just copy that. It's very similar to the status. But of course it has those the differences between the names and stuff. So this is customer now. So this is set company name. This is set first name. And this is set last name. Now, oops, hydrator, that's not good, is it? There we go. We don't need that. That is going to return a customer. Okay. So that's cool. I'm liking that. Let's move that out to here. Just to no, tab. And I don't know why my returns. What's going on with my formatting? What's going on? There we go. That's better. Okay. Now notice that we have some duplication here. We have the set created dates and updated dates, and we also have the IDs. So this portion is exactly the same as the status table, which is also not formatted correctly. I do apologize. Let's put that in. There we go. So we could, if we wanted to, we could extend a base hydrator and call parent hydrate. We could try and do that. Perhaps let's run that. So let's create an abstract hydrator. It's abstract because there's not going to be any constructor here. It is completely abstract. It just has some utility methods. So we're passing in the date, and what we want to do is we want to pass in the hydrate, but we also want to pass in the entity that we're currently working upon, entity, because what we want to do is we want to update these things, and then we want to return it. and then we want to return it. Yeah. So not found. Okay, so then that returns a mixed job. So if we go back to, say, the status hydrator, actually, let's just get this test working before I start faffing about with that. Let's just run this test a minute. Sorry, I'm going a mile a minute here. That still failed. So let's work on this first before we refactor this code. So something's wrong. Oh yeah, that's wrong. So this is what, a good reason why I do my testing like this, because stupid mistakes like this I do spot. It's almost like someone is stood over my shoulder complaining at my code, which is good. I need that. Okay, so that's passed. That's all good. I'm liking that. So now let's see if we can refactor this a little bit more, because obviously we're going to have an invoice hydrator and we're going to have an invoice item hydrator. We don't want to be faffing about with the dates all the time. We want to just run that from something. So I'm going to see if I can extend abstract hydrator. Now this is going to complain. This is going to complain because it's not going to have the entity, right? Because this needs to conform to the entity that we wish to use. So this is an interesting case, because what I was hoping to achieve was we would do parent. And this would be great for the OOP course. I was hoping to do this, so we pass in that, and and the parent would then handle this stuff. So I wouldn't need to worry about this. So one could argue that perhaps we shouldn't be instantiating a new customer at this point. Perhaps we should be passing in the entity that we wish here. So perhaps we need to do entity, and because we can't really, entity, and then that becomes the customer. But the problem there is that the declaration needs to be the same throughout. So maybe we need to remove that. Yeah. Okay, so that then becomes just the bits for the status, for the customer, and the parent hydrator will hydrate the other bits like the date created and all of that stuff. So one then can argue that perhaps we need to have an interface on the entities that have this ability. So perhaps we should create that. So maybe if I went down to where are we? Entity here. These are all the entities. So perhaps we need to have an interface. So we do new PHP file, and we do this. We call this. We're going to call this generic entity interface, and the generic entity interface has the bits and pieces So sorry, this is the interface, generic entity, and we don't need to worry about that. What is the abstract entity? Let me refresh my memory. What is that about? Ah, the abstract entity has all of this stuff. Okay. Of course. Okay, so the abstract entity. has all of that. Okay, let me think about that for a minute, because that is abstract. Okay, what I was hoping to do is move this stuff into an interface like this, and then so we remove all of this jazz because it's an interface. It doesn't have any of this stuff. So we have get ID. We have set ID. This is quite the change. And then we have get updated. These are no longer null. These are no longer null. Same with this. This is no longer null. Yep. The reason why I'm doing this, it might be weird. Why am I removing the abstract entity? Well, the reason why I'm doing this and I'm forcing everything to be required is because now I've got a generic entity interface that I can move around. I can move around. So, for example, if I was to, why is that red? What's going on? What's the problem here? What's going on with that? Oh yeah, that. Because now what I can do is I can do customer implements generic entity interface, and because we extend the abstract entity interface, that's fine. That should be okay. Whoops, come here. Let's put that implementation on all of the classes. So same with invoice. Same with invoice item. Same with status. Because in the abstract hydrator method that we've got up here, we are only caring about this portion of the code, which is the generic part of the entity. Every entity will have this, which means that we can define it here. So we can do generic entity interface, which means if I just make that smaller, if I can I make that smaller? Yeah. We now have on entity, we now have all of these things. So we should have entity set date created, date updated, and then the ID. Okay. So that now, means that, sorry, that way, that works. Now the problem there is that we don't have, why is that coming out as date created? And well, perhaps I need to just, instead of chaining them, maybe I need to do date, entity, 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 and then line them up like that. Okay. Now the problem there is that, well, there isn't really a problem, to be honest. If we go back to the customer, we're passing in the entity, and the entity is the various well, it is the generic entity. But what we could do, of course, is that we could require it as such. So that could become a required thing. But we can't do that because we're requiring a generic instance, because this isn't the same. It must be the duplicate. That should be, whoops, the same. Whoops, what have I done? What have I done? So the declaration, this signature, needs to be the same as what's in the parent. And of course, what's on the parent is the generic entity interface. And in customer, we actually need this. Now, one thing we could do is detach this, so it's not actually the parent. It's not actually on Hydrate. It's just another call. That would sort of suffice. Or what we could do is we could extend the interfaces. We could do that. So we could, in the, where are we? Here, generic entity interface. We could, for let's say the customer, for instance, we could do customer entity interface, and the customer entity interface would extend the generic entity interface. Okay. Let's just remove all of this stuff, and hopefully, I'm not sure if this is going to work, but I'm just playing. So customer entity interface, and then we fill out all the bits and pieces that represent the customer table, customer entity, obviously not the mechanics of how that represents. But when we're playing around with classes, moving them around, what I'm doing here is playing around with the contractual sides of the classes. If we go down to the customer hydrator, and we filled that in, that's customer entity interface. What's going on here? Yeah, that declaration also needs to be the same. So that's tricky. I was hoping that you would sort of go, oh, okay, it extends that, so that would be fine, but obviously not. This stuff is not the case. Okay. Let me think. One thing what we could do to get away with this is we could do hydrate rest, right? So this is going to hydrate the rest of the stuff, which requires the generic jobby. And then in the customer hydrator here, we do hydrate rest, which would essentially work because the entity is a customer entity interface which extends the generic entity. So that would kind of work. Yeah. Because this is hydrating the rest of the stuff. It's like, when you've got a twig form and you're hydrating the rest, you're filling out the rest of the stuff. So let's continue down. I mean, this could just be customer. Now it doesn't need to be an interface. It could be just the customer that we're hydrating. And of course, because we're using the other bits and pieces, we could not pass that through and then instantiate it here. So we could just do this. So we could do customer is equal to new customer, or sorry, entity equals new. It depends. It really depends. It's sort of like thinking about where does a entity start and where does it finish. Yeah. Because you know, maybe we want to create entities without hydrating them, right? Maybe we want to do something to the entity before it gets hydrated. I don't know. So yeah. Anyway, I've made some changes here to the customer. I'm going to run these and just see if this all works again. Which it doesn't, because something's gone wrong. I see. Because I've changed all of these things. Okay, let's just quickly go and faff about with all of that. So with the we're on customer, so we're not going to worry about that. Bye bye. So the problem here is that with the customer. Let's open that up. Let's open that up. There we go. The problem here is that this isn't the same stuff. So the declarations need to be the same. And what I've done is I've allowed them all to be optional, which isn't the case. These should all be filled out. Or should they? Now I'm starting to think perhaps this wasn't the best idea. No. Let's leave them as they were. Let's change the interface. I think it was that. Let's just quickly run that through. Yeah, okay. I need to think about this. You know, when you instantiate a new class and you call getID, it's not going to return you an integer because you haven't hydrated it yet. It'll only return you an integer, once you've hydrated it. So I need to think about that. If same with the dates and stuff. If, of course, when we instantiate that in the constructor we set all these things, then yes, sure, they will certainly come back. But because we're relying upon the hydrator to hydrate the entity from the records, we need to have a blank canvas to work on. So yeah. So that's all good. I'm liking that. I'm just going to quickly run the units all together and see what has just if there's anything broken at all. Nope. 75 tests, 145 assertions, so everything is still as stable as it was. So I'm happy with that. Oops. So yeah, this is all good. this is looking good so far. We have a generic entity interface that means that I can move this stuff around and do various things with it. Maybe we'll have an interface per entity, I don't know. But in terms of this, we don't need to do that. I'm going to just run the hydrate rest as well for the status. Let's bring them both up together. So with the status hydrator, we don't want to do any of this stuff or any of this stuff because we want to allow a single piece of code that does this. We don't need that at all. We do need to extend a abstract hydrator, and we are going to call parent hydrate rest, passing in the data as well as the entity. So let's run the hydrators together. That's cool. Excellent. Let's also, we need to put in a test for these dates, don't we? So if we go into, let's use the status one for now. We need to put in, because at the moment we're not testing at all these things. So let's just go ahead and create a test for the date. Whoops. Oh, come on. There we go. So we could test the instance of, because we're not worried about the actual value of the date. We just want to make sure that it is a date time. So the instance is a date time class. And this is get date updated. Same with get dates created. I'm going to do created first, updated second, and then I'm going to copy all of this stuff and paste it into the customer test. And then I'm going to run these tests again. Whoops, up. Both of these tests together. We should have a couple more assertions, and they are all working. Hello, very muchly. I can't speak. Is it batch drav? Batch drav? Let me just double check. Batch drav. Yes. Hello, Batch Drav. Thank you very much for following. I do appreciate it. I hope you're doing well. I hope you're having a good day, good start to the day. It is 8:40 a.m. here in the UK. I'm going to round up this stream very soon because I do have to push on and do some work, obviously, pay the bills. So, yeah, thank you very much for following. I do a live stream like this, well, pretty much every morning. We're building a FreeCodeCamp course. I'm going to be teaching object-oriented programming in that course, and that course will require an application to be built, and this is the invoice application that I'm building. So this isn't the course. This isn't me teaching. This is me developing the application, and then what I'm going to do once the application is built, once we have all of these tests in place, I'm going to tear down this application and then sort of almost recreate it, perhaps not in the raw sense of the word, but I'm going to recreate portions of this that represent good examples of object-oriented programming. That is the plan. It's running Docker. Both of these, they're two containers. There's a MySQL container and an Apache PHP container, which are all good. So yeah, thank you very much for following Batchclaw. I do appreciate it. Cool. Let's run all of the units together. 75 tests, 159 assertions. Assertions, I should say, not assertions, assertions. It's a shame I couldn't get that to 150. But, such as life, we'll certainly do that tomorrow. We've done both of the status and the customer hydration mechanisms. They have both been done in today's stream. I will commit all of this and push this up to the GitHub repo after the stream, I do promise. And tomorrow, which is Friday, we are going to be looking at the invoice and maybe the invoice item. These are the difficult ones to hydrate because we are going to be dealing with foreign keys, and I'm not sure yet how I'm going to approach that. We might have to call upon external resources at least the manager to do that. I'm not entirely sure yet. So yeah, I'm kind of creating this and developing this and architecting this as I go. So I'm kind of thinking as I'm talking, as I'm coding. Which I know is not up to everyone's tastes, but this is the way I develop. So we've got these tests in here. I will commit these up and push these up. I should say that the not last stream, but the stream before, I think that was 22 or 23. It was 23. That is now live on YouTube. So if you haven't done so already, please follow me on the YouTube channel. That's How to Code Well. And I will tweet the next time I go live, which I'll probably tweet tonight or tomorrow morning or something like that, about the time in which I plan to go live. A quick shout out to the podcast that's happening tomorrow. We have Oliver Davies on the show talking about static site generators and the static site generators that we've both used, the pros and cons of them. So it's a very interesting chat with him tomorrow. And there's every week, every Friday, I do a guest show. So there is a guest on every Friday, and we talk about various things in web development. Some very interesting guests that I've had on the show. So please check that out. That's howtocodewell.fm for the podcast. In regard to this course, it is taking me longer than I would have hoped. However, there is a lot involved here. It is, after all, a whole framework that we're building, so it is taking a fair amount of time. And obviously, I'm coding and talking and thinking at the same time, as I mentioned, which does take an awful lot of time, and it is also fairly tiring too mentally. So yeah, it's not as quick as I could just suddenly bash out and get done. But what I'm going to do is, or what I have been doing is, I have been building a Gatsby.js website that will have all of these streams on, so off of the YouTube channel, because obviously Twitch will delete these streams after a certain amount of time, which is a shame, really. So I've been putting them on YouTube, not the same day as I've been going live. I think we're like we're about 2 episodes behind on YouTube. But eventually they'll go onto this Gatsby site, and this Gatsby site will also have the embedded course in as well for FreeCodeCamp 2. Now, this website will be hosted on Hostinger. Hostinger is our sponsor for this live stream. And at the moment, you can get 82% off web hosting and a free domain if you use the code Peter Fisher. So that's hostinger.com/Peter Fisher, and you'll also be helping out the channel, which is fantastic. 82% off is an amazing deal. Plus, you get a free domain. It's extremely affordable, Hostinger, and it's quite reliable. So I've used them before. They're very, very good. And also, if you use the discount code Peter Fisher, all one word, you also get a further 15% off, which is, crazy, right? It's an amazing deal. So links in the show notes below for that too. Thank you very much, Hostinger, for sponsoring this live stream and making this possible. And of course, check out the howtocodewell.fm website too. But anyway, I need to dash off. I need to get on and do some freelance work. So happy coding, everyone. And I will see you again tomorrow morning, if not on the podcast on Friday. Thank you very much. Happy coding. Cheers. Bye-bye.